Good morning, everyone. How's everyone doing? I hope you're doing well. Welcome to, this is Keep the Promise Coalition. This is part one of a series we're calling In the Community. This is a series about mental health, disability, and race, and their relationship to housing. This is part one. Part one is about history. You can see on your screen if you are tuning in and you need language interpretation in Spanish, those are the instructions there. Please find the globe in your menu bar. If you don't see a globe, check the three dots that say more in your menu bar. Look for where it says interpretation, and then click Spanish if you need language interpretation. If you don't need it, it's still a good idea to click English. I'm going to leave that up for just a moment and then we can get started. Thank you all so much for joining us today.
Just to let you know, they just received it.
Thank you, Kat.
You're welcome.
And if everyone can just keep their questions in the chat, we'll take those when we get to the questions. Thank you all. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So my name is Jordan Fairchild. As I said, I'm from Keep the Promise Coalition. And today's training is going to be about mental health, disability, race, and housing, and the history of housing for all of those groups of people. The title is In the Community, and this is part one. It's about history. I just want to start off by saying thank you. This series is made possible by grants from the Connecticut Council on Developmental Disabilities, as well as the Catalyst Endowment Fund at Hartford Foundation for Public Giving. I also want to say thank you to our facilitators for today, Connecticut Fair Housing Center and Connecticut Legal Rights Project. Rashida Rattray and Kathy Flaherty will be our facilitators today. And later on in this series, Danielle Hubley from the Partnership for Strong Communities will also be facilitating. I also just want to say thank you to Jesus Ramos and Noah Vinogradov, who had helped us out with this training a little bit. So as I said, this is part one of this training. It's about the history of housing for people of color, people with mental health conditions, and people with disabilities. Next month, we'll be having part two, which is about knowing your rights, identifying what housing discrimination looks like and what to do about it. And then in August, we'll also be having a training about making policy change. What are some successful policy solutions and how to advocate for them. So, excuse me, our presenters today are going to be Rashida Rattray, Kathy Flaherty, and we'll have a special guest appearance from Karen Healy as well. And we're going to start off by talking about the history of our housing system today. Then we're going to move into talking about a very important Supreme Court case to housing named Olmstead v. LC. And then Karen Healy is going to talk about what housing has meant to her. So without further ado, I will give it now to Rashida Rattray to start us off.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much, Jordan, for that introduction. I am Rashida Rattray, the Education and Outreach Coordinator over at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center. And today I would love to do some level setting regarding the Fair Housing Act and why the Fair Housing Act was so necessary. So starting off, we want to talk about the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which was passed in April of 1968, 7 days after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. This act has made sure that everyone has equal access to housing that are free from discrimination. It bans housing discrimination that happens based on your identity in a protected class. Connecticut has done a really good job of passing additional protections, which makes Connecticut's fair housing protected classes some of the strongest that we have in our country. Next slide, please. So here is a listing of your federal and state fair housing protections. To the left, federally or countrywide, it is a violation of the Fair Housing Act to discriminate against anyone in any housing transaction based on your race, color, national origin, sex, disability, religion, or familial status. And familial status is the presence of children within a family. The state of Connecticut has added state-specific protected classes to their lists, and those are ancestry, marital status, age, sexual orientation, lawful source of income, gender identity and expression, and veteran status. So these are our state of Connecticut specific protected classes. The Fair Housing Act has actually been a springboard for advocacy in many places. And I like to highlight that disability was added to our protected class list as of 1988. So we're very grateful for the Fair Housing Act to have put us in a place where we're able to advocate for other protected classes to be added to this list. We also want to highlight that there is some vocabulary that we're going to go through today to kind of level set with the presentation, and you will see that on our next slide. We all have our own individual definitions of these terms that we use from day to day, but for the purpose of this presentation, we will define policy as rules that are written and enforced. These rules can be for businesses, groups, institutions, or government agencies. Systemic and institutional inequality can be defined as when bias and power are used to discriminate. This leads to unequal treatment for specific people, groups, or communities. Next slide, please. Our built environment can be defined as everything that we have built in our communities. This includes houses, sidewalks, highways, and more. And a subsidy can be defined as money given to an institution, business, or person. Next slide, please. Racial segregation can be defined as separate housing, education, and other services based on race, specifically for the purpose of this presentation, separating white and non-white people. Next slide. So I gave Connecticut a huge pat on the back earlier because we did a really good job with enacting additional protected classes and having some very strong fair housing laws in our state. But unfortunately, the United States and the state of Connecticut are still very segregated. 67% of the state's population of color lives in only 8% of Connecticut's towns. So what does that look like on a map? You'll see in the next slide. So this map represents the percent of non-white residents by census tract, and that is represented by the color blue. So the blue representation on this map is the percent of non-white residents. So we are doing a very good job with enacting the fair housing laws. We know that we have protected classes. We know that we have an agency in the state of Connecticut that we can go to report housing discrimination. But we're trying our best to do better in enforcing the Fair Housing Act so that this map will look a lot more diverse with a lot more blue splotches across the map, meaning that across the map, we will have a higher percent of non-white residents in the state of Connecticut. Next slide, please. Getting into the history of fair housing. Decades of discriminatory policies shaped our built environment. These policies still have a harmful effect on people of color even today. They have led to a lack of wealth in communities of color and racial and economic segregation in our communities. Next slide, please. Was racial segregation an accident? Unfortunately, the answer to that question is no. Discriminatory public policy drove private development, and that further segregated our communities. So to give you a brief timeline of what we will be discussing today, we're going to talk about the Industrial Revolution and development that happened in the early 1900s. We're going to talk about the New Deal and redlining that happened in the 1930s. We'll discuss post-war suburban development that occurred in the 1950s, as well as the Federal Interstate Highway Act of 1956 and urban renewal and relocation that happened in the 1950s and 1960s. All of these instances are going to provide the reasoning behind why the Fair Housing Act is so important and what barriers we have to fair housing today. Next slide, please. So we are starting off in the Industrial Revolution and early 1900s development, where we've seen a very heavy dependency on factories. Factories are what shaped our communities. Factories started growing their workforce in the early 1900s, and at that time, there were no zoning rules. So factories developed our communities. There was a great need for land use planning that led to factory development. Factory would build housing and communities for their workers. Next slide. But unfortunately, most of that workforce housing was only for white workers. This kept people of color away from safe and stable housing near their work. And this is a tradition that is continued today that involves long-standing discrimination against people of color. So unfortunately, people of color were not able to attain safe and stable housing near their work. So they were forced to fend for themselves and forced to find resources for themselves. So they were forced to the outskirts of town, away from these resource-rich pockets that were created around factories. Next slide, please. A lot of this zoning and workforce housing development that was happening at the time was not something that was implied or something that was whispered. This was something that was explicit. You can see where the red arrow is pointing on the screen to a headline from the Metropolitan News of West Hartford in December of 1943, where it explicitly reads, "Negroes may not move into the Dackwood War housing tract." The other excerpt on the screen is from the land records of the town of West Hartford, Connecticut, where it says that no person of any race except the white race shall use or occupy any building on any lot, except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race employed by an owner or a tenant. So a lot of the time, people of color and families of color could not live in this workforce housing unless they were a domestic servant of someone who was living there or owned that property. So I say all of this to say this was not something that was implied. This was something that was boldly stated, that everyone knew that people of color did not have access to workforce housing that was developed around factories. Next slide, please. So now we are in the 1920s, and this is where the birth of zoning happened with the Zoning Enabling Act of 1927. This act happened to be one of the foundational developments in land use planning in the United States. This introduced exclusionary zoning, in which ordinances to exclude certain types of land uses from a given community, especially to regulate racial and economic diversity, occurred. These ordinances were typically used to prevent Black, Latinx, and poor migrant families from moving into middle and upper class neighborhoods. Municipalities used and continue to use zoning to limit the supply of available housing units, such as by prohibiting multifamily residential dwellings or setting minimum lot size requirements. These ordinances raise costs, making it less likely that lower income groups will move into certain neighborhoods. Simultaneously, these zoning laws and ordinances ensured that many of the Black parts of town or parts of town where the population of color was focused were zoned for things such as industrial plants, waste disposal, and other things that would be considered blight. And meanwhile, those businesses were explicitly kept out of white neighborhoods in the same cities. Next slide. The New Deal sought to prevent foreclosures and encourage new home construction to increase the number of people who owned homes. It created two housing agencies. One is the HOLC, or the Homeowners Loan Corporation. The other is the FHA, or the Federal Housing Administration. Together, these two agencies created maps and set uniform national appraisal methods to simplify the mortgage process. This is called redlining today. These maps that were created in the 1930s assessed creditworthiness. These were color-coded by race, with the majority of the African American areas were marked in red or yellow and designated as high risk or hazardous. These areas were also not seen as ideal for real estate investment. Meanwhile, the green and blue areas indicated the best neighborhoods for mortgage investment, which, not ironically, were where the where white families were focused. Mortgage companies, banks, and the insurance industry use these maps to justify racist mortgage lending and home insurance policies. This impact continues today with an increase in racial segregation and a decline in home ownership, house values, and credit scores in redlined areas. Next slide, please. So now we're moving into the 1950s. And by the 1950s, housing construction in the cities was primarily public housing. Meanwhile, in the suburbs, builders concentrated on building single-family, owner-occupied homes. Many families financed these homes with mortgages from the FHA, or the Federal Housing Administration. Now, we learned in the last slide that these mortgages that were made by the Federal Housing Administration had a negative impact on people of color. Many families, many of these housing developments and many of the government loan programs were almost exclusively for white people, which excluded people of color from being able to attain these loans. Many housing developments restricted occupancy by members other than the Caucasian race. An important provision of the GI Bill was low interest, zero down payment loans for white servicemen. with more favorable terms for new construction compared to existing housing. This encouraged millions of white families to move out of their urban apartments and into suburban homes. The abandoned urban apartments were still not available to Black servicemen and their families, since many public housing projects, such as Charter Oak, had racial quotas. White flight happened in this period of time, which is defined as the sudden or gradual large-scale migration of white people from areas becoming more racially or culturally diverse. Unfortunately, Black, Latinx, and poor migrant families weren't even able to move into the homes that white families were leaving due to the restrictive racial covenants that were put in place back in the 1920s. Next slide, please. The Federal Housing Administration had two goals after World War II. We saw a great boom in money that was being poured into the federal government. And the Federal Housing Administration took that money and said, we have two goals with it. The first goal is to use community development to help stimulate the economy. And the second goal was to encourage investments based on prejudice. They wanted white families to be able to attain these homes in the suburbs while keeping families of color in the multifamily housing that they had been living in for so long. The money that they had gotten from World War II, they were investing it in the suburbs at a rapid pace, but they weren't giving much money to upkeep the properties where families of color were living. Next slide, please. We're about to talk about highway development and urban renewal, but I really want to highlight a quote by Elena Samuels from The Atlantic that explains what was happening and what was the perception of what was happening at the time that highway development and urban renewal were beginning. Elena says, they could have their highways and they could get rid of their slums. With just one surgery, they could put in more arteries and they could remove the city's heart. And we're going to get into what Elena meant by this quote. Next slide. Highway construction in the 1940s, moving into the 1950s, wrecked communities of color. And this was only the beginning of how we would wreck communities of color. Cities focused on urban renewal when money for highways ran out. Beginning in the 1950s, the federal government reshaped American cities through urban renewal, zoning, residential density, automobile usage, and highway construction. Equipped with billions of dollars in federal funding, local governments applied eminent domain to displace hundreds of thousands of non-white, migrant, and poor families across the country, deeming long-standing neighborhoods blighted land that was unfit for habitation. Homeowners were forced into becoming renters, and much of the compensation given in exchange for eminent domain seizure was based on the undervaluation of those properties. Urban renewal included the construction of vast system of highways to make urban centers more accessible for suburban residents by automobile. So with this great dependency on the automobile, the federal government wanted to cater to people who lived in the suburbs. So they built highways through urban neighborhoods. And when that money ran out, they came up with urban renewal as a way to continue to wreck communities of color. Next slide, please. The goals of urban renewal were to replace public spaces with private businesses. They wanted to plan for a greater reliance on cars. They wanted to create urban centers that would appeal to people that lived in the suburbs, to create more jobs by building the infrastructure, and ultimately to clear the slums that we had just spent decades creating. Next slide, please. Here are two pictures of what urban renewal looked like in Hartford and New Haven. To my left, you see an Italian foods market. And in order to build Constitution Plaza in Hartford, the developers had to raise a 12-acre neighborhood, including this Italian product store on the corner of Front and Market Street. Urban neighborhoods with migrants, poor families, and non-white people were appraised for demolition, while the suburbs were being developed at a rapid pace. The before and after picture on the right shows an image of the Oak Street neighborhood in New Haven, and it shows how it was bulldozed and replaced by a highway. People's livelihoods were taken from them. Not only were homes demolished, but so were businesses, all in the name of making highways to cater for individuals that lived in the suburbs. Next slide, please. The outcomes of urban renewal were that housing was not fully replaced. Estimates suggest that there was only 1 unit of housing built for every 3 that were lost. Private funding followed into the suburbs, and this left abandoned empty lots in cities. People in the suburbs recognized that they could just build these fixtures, these structures, these things that they wanted to access in urban centers in the suburbs. And displacement from this was not counted after 1967. So we are sure that there were many people that may have been displaced after 1967, but we only have displacement counted up until 1967. Next slide, please. As we move into the 1960s and we talk about the civil rights movement and housing, I also want to highlight that the civil rights movement paved the way for disability rights. The civil rights movement and the work of Martin Luther King Jr. played a huge role in the creation of the fair housing laws and their protections. And we already discussed earlier that the fair housing laws were the springboard of many different advocacy efforts that came afterwards. The Chicago Open Housing Movement, also known as the Chicago Freedom Movement, took place from mid-1965 till early 1967. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, then led by Martin Luther King Jr., targeted Chicago due to high levels of institutionalized discrimination in schools and in housing. On January 26, 1966, Martin Luther King Jr. moved into an apartment at 1550 South Hamlin Ave on Chicago's west side near Douglas Park. He said at the time, according to Tribune Archives, that he moved to the apartment to dramatize slum conditions in the city. He held a variety of events in the city to draw attention to the slums after he moved there. The open housing movement fought against mortgage and loan discrimination, and it called for tenants' rights, quality education for all, and equal access to jobs. Next slide, please. Now, when we think of the fight for integration, a lot of the time people look at the big cities, right? They look at Chicago, Washington, D.C., New York. But I would also like to highlight that there was a fight for integration here in Hartford as well. Pictured above, you see the Black Panthers and other civil rights activists protesting at Sand Elementary School in the north end of Hartford. From the 1920s to the 1960s, Connecticut's African American activists formed several membership groups. And these membership groups such as the Negro Defense Council or the Hartford League of Struggle for Negro Rights, were just some of the organizations that not only protested against police and vigilante violence on a local and national scale, but they also advocated for equal treatment of Blacks across the state of Connecticut. So advocacy was happening in our own backyards as well. Next slide, please. This has brought me to the end of our presentation, or the history portion of our presentation, rather. And I would love to segue into the next portion of our presentation, which will include Kathy Flaherty, and she will give us some background on Olmsted VLC. Thank you guys for your time.
Thank you so much, Rashida. And I'm looking through the chat right now, and I don't see any questions for Rashida. So if you do have questions, we're going to put our emails up at the end of the presentation, and you can just reach out and we'll make sure to get those answered. But for now, thank you so much, Rashida. That was fantastic. And we're going to move on to Kathy's part. Actually, we will be taking a short break just to give everyone a few minutes to regroup, and then we will move on to Kathy's portion. So we will see you in 5 minutes. Continuing now, and we will be moving on to Kathy Flaherty from Connecticut Legal Rights Project, who's going to be talking about the Olmsted decision. Welcome, Kathy.
Thank you, Jordan. Everybody may or may not be aware, but yesterday was the 23rd anniversary of the U.S. Supreme Court decision, Olmsted v. LC. A lot of people refer to this decision as the Olmsted decision, which is very frustrating as a disability advocate because Olmsted is the last name of the governor of the state of Georgia, which was discriminating against disabled people. If you go to the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about vocabulary first, and then I'll have the opportunity to introduce you to LC, who is Lois Curtis. But just like in Rashida's presentation, want to make sure that we're on the same page in terms of what we mean about particular words that we're using. So when we talk about institutions or the concept of institutionalization, we are talking about places where people with mental health conditions and disabilities get treatment, but separate from their communities. And it shows a historical picture of what could very well be what was then called the Connecticut Hospital for the Insane, what we now call Connecticut Valley Hospital. When we talk about community-based services, we're talking about programs that serve people in their own communities where they live. And we have a little graphic showing people in a house. Next slide. When we talk about something being appropriate, and I know that that's a word that some of us sometimes have challenges with dealing with because we don't like that label, but it's talking about when the community-based option is really what's best for the person with a green check mark. And when something's voluntary, that's when somebody's choosing of their own free will to do something rather than being forced to do it. And so they're giving it a thumbs up. Next slide. And when we talk about something that's accommodating, it's something that meets someone's needs or their wants. And this happens to show a little graphic of a person who uses a wheelchair who's going up a ramp because that makes the building accessible as well as accommodating their needs. Next slide. So Olmsted VLC, sometimes referred to as Olmsted, is a 1999 United States Supreme Court case. But it is a case of two women with disabilities, Lois Curtis, who's the LC, and Elaine Wilson. They both had mental illness and developmental disabilities, and they were in a state hospital in Georgia. Next slide. So both of them had been voluntarily admitted to a psychiatric unit. And at some point during their treatment, the people in charge of the hospital unit recommended that they be moved to a community-based program because they realized that these women could receive services in the community safely and appropriately. But regardless of that, they each remained at the institution for years after their acute treatment ended. So they literally were living at the state hospital. Next slide. So the exciting thing about this case that most people don't know is that this was actually a case that was started by lawyers at the Atlanta Legal Aid Society. So there's a certain level of pride in being a legal aid lawyer, a disability rights lawyer, and realizing that this year we're celebrating the 23rd anniversary of this decision. So what did the ruling say? The United States Supreme Court ruled on what does the Americans with Disability Act actually mean? If you think about laws and you remember Schoolhouse Rock, if you're old enough to remember that, Congress passes the law, the executive branch enforces the law, but it's the courts that interpret the law. So when the Supreme Court issued this ruling, they were the ones saying, this is how we're interpreting Congress's intent. This is what we think Congress meant when they passed this law. And what they ruled in an opinion that was authored by the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg was that one of the goals of the Americans with Disabilities Act was to secure opportunities to live in the community for people with disabilities. Next slide. So what Olmstead says is that public institutions, and when we're talking about that, it's really like the states must provide community-based programs to people with disabilities as long as placement in that community-based program is three things. First, it has to be appropriate. We talked about what that meant. Second, it has to be voluntary. You can't force a person with a disability to leave an institution. And then lastly, that it meets the needs, it's accommodating, and it's available to everyone at all levels of care. Next slide. That's what the ruling means, but what's sometimes more important is what it actually doesn't mean in some of the issues we still see today. This slide includes a great picture of Lois at the White House with President Obama, showing him some of her art, because Lois is a fantastically talented artist. Lois got out, Elaine got out, but not everybody is getting out even today, because the ruling does not mean that everyone in an institution will be discharged. The decision also didn't require that states either close hospitals or that they discharge people quickly. What the court said in their ruling is that states have to consider the availability of resources, and they should also discharge people at a reasonable pace. I think the pace that we might consider reasonable is probably very different from what state administrators consider reasonable. If this language seems a little familiar, sort of the same language that they used in Brown versus Board of Education when they said things should happen with all deliberate speed, which means it depends on who's elected and who's in office about how quickly they actually move. And do they do everything that they can to create those opportunities for people to live in the community? Next slide. This was a very short, very condensed presentation on Olmsted. Connecticut Legal Rights Project exists to represent people who are living in Connecticut's state-operated inpatient psychiatric facilities, because we still have large hospitals. We have Connecticut Valley Hospital and Whiting Forensic Hospital in Middletown, and they have smaller state-operated psychiatric hospitals or institutions in Hartford, New Haven, and Bridgeport. And the average length of stay for somebody at Connecticut Valley Hospital right now is 3.5 years. In my opinion, no one should be in a hospital that long. People should not be living in hospitals. People should be living in our communities, getting the voluntary supports and services that they need. And we will talk more at the next presentation about how people can protect their rights in the community. And I hope in the future, we can talk more about the opportunities and the history and the very frankly ugly history of institutionalization of people with mental health conditions. Jordan, I think that's it for my part of the presentation. And I believe now the next step is the video.
Thank you so much, Kathy. And I just want to give a short introduction as well to Karen Healy, who will be featured in the video that you're going to see next. She's experienced what life is like inside of a psychiatric hospital. And this is a really great video clip from a series that NBC Connecticut did last year, where she is interviewed, and we will have her on shortly after. Just takes a moment to load. Sorry for the technical issues. I'm going to pull it up online. Give me 1 second.
Oh. 24.5 years of my life was mostly state hospitals. It really hurt inside as a human being to have not to see the outside, not to even get a breath air for a year straight because I had hurt myself. I have borderline 1, borderline axis 2. I have bipolar Massachusetts disease, I don't know if I'm saying it the right way, but that's someone who has, you can go to a doctor and you think there's something wrong, and you can go and get every test in the world and you still think something's wrong. I cut myself to the point where I thought I made up a story saying that I actually got bit by a dog. No, it wasn't a dog. I had done it to myself. I nicked myself at home with a razor superficial on my wrist, and I was in my morning resource class, and my teacher saw it and sent me to the nurse's office, where they called the superintendent, called my mom, and they kicked me out of school. When I received this key on December 4th of 2014, it meant the world to me that I'm a normal person in the community and I have my own way of letting myself in and out. In the facilities, you can't do that. You know, going 24 and a half years of my life, from August of 1989 to December 4th of 2014, was mostly state hospitals. Being in state hospitals where I did most self-injury to myself, more than even outside in residentials, and living at home when I was younger. For 1 year, I couldn't even have anything. Like, I was in a CO room where there's no windows. I had a blanket, a sheet, and my pillow. I'd even have a comfort item for a year. I couldn't even have like a picture of stuffed animal. It's like almost a year until my mom fought for that. You're taking someone who's hurt themselves and telling you can't have your stuff. Get better and then you will. But what kind of inspiration do you have if you can't even have a picture of someone or a card from somebody? They had level systems where if you buy behavior, it goes from like CO 1-to-1 to CO 15-minute checks, and then there's a level start at 1 and goes up to level 4, level 5, where you can have privileges to go off the unit, to go outside to a courtyard, to go on grounds to walk and go to a cafe. And you had to have privileges to do that. You had to have behavior. Like, my history is with hurting myself sometimes. I had to show enough stuff for them to go on to give me a privilege with having negative behavior. For example, for 1 whole year in a state place, was on a 1-to-1 for a whole year, where I never, ever saw the outside of a gated window, fence gated window, for a year. I never went outside and never saw outside for a year because I had hurt myself. It really hurt inside as a human being to have, not to see the outside, not to even get a breath air for a year straight.
Even though sometimes these illnesses do impact the brain, we have found that people are much more willing to engage in a path to recovery if they feel they've got not only a say in the matter, but skin in the game, so to speak. And we want to meet people where they are. We have found that, sending someone to the hospital and having doctors say you need to do X, Y, and Z doesn't work real well, especially when you consider that for a lot of people with an underlying mental health condition, what they're often lacking is human connection. That alienation tends to drive a lot of these illnesses and certainly make them worse.
I would agree that being treated in your home community is a much healthier response. Being able to be in a neighborhood or community that you grew up in with your church group or your support group, all of that is really important to be a member and a citizen of your community.
I've always wanted an animal of my own. So I had to agree, Goodwill agreed with me, if I had 6 to 8 weeks with no negative behavior, ER for anything negative, that they'd be willing to let me have a cat. And I've had her 2 years, 3 years I've had Emma. And I adopted from the PO in East Hartford, the cat shelter, and I would never give her up. I love her so much. Even though she doesn't jump on me, she loves me and I love her. And that sometimes is what keeps me going, not wanting to pick up a phone to run to a hospital sometimes. Who would take care of her if I wasn't here? It's just like having a human being, it's just having a child. You don't want to walk out on the care of your child. She's checking you out more than she checks everybody else, and now she's going to back up. You're okay, Emma. He's not going to do it. See what it is? They said when I got her, she's not a good, proud person. So, in my opinion, if someone had listened to me 10 years ago, I might not have done all the damage I did to my body. I maybe not got to the extreme of what I had done to myself. I can't go back and take my scars off my arms or anything. But there's got to be someone who can listen to somebody who's in pain and suffering.
I hear again and again people's horror stories of having been in the quote unquote locked psych ward. They're trying to do the right thing, and I get that. But no one's ever come back to me and said, I spent 3 weeks in a locked ward, and oh, that was such a great experience. I've heard again and again and again how traumatizing it is and how they didn't get the help that they really needed. So how do we fix that?
Courtyard. If I wasn't because of my sister, Claude, and goodwill of my mom when she was alive, I think I still might be still sitting there 7 years later, watching people climb the walls and screaming and going off, you know?
Do you think there are people that do need that institute?
Yes, but I think sometimes people, because someone might do something, doesn't mean they have to be put away for the rest of their life, you know?
People often will think the worst is going to happen, and unfortunately, because of the nature of these illnesses, sometimes the worst does happen. Not everyone has a happy ending. I just have to be honest about that. Some families, because of the severity of these illnesses and the suicidal ideation that's very common in different types of mental health conditions, sometimes the person ends up taking their life, which is always a tragedy. But you certainly improve your chances if you're educated and you have the supports, and you can be an advocate for your loved one while they struggle to get on a meaningful path to recovery.
September of 2013 was when I was readmitted, and I took myself and looked at myself back again, realizing this is not really what I want to be. I said to myself, I couldn't do that to myself anymore. I tell myself I've been through so much to have what I have now. If I gave up all myself a long time ago, who knows what would have happened to me.
Being in facilities, if I wanted to go take a yogurt, I couldn't do that. You can't just go in the kitchen, get a yogurt and sit and eat it and sit with your feet up. Living in the community, you can go in, I can go in whatever time I want.
I'm not a diagnosis, I'm not a number. I'm a human being with real feelings, and a person might take meds and have different issues. But I'm a human being like anybody else. I'm not a label anymore.
Poverty has its own sets of traumas.
Talk to him. There you go.
So thank you so much. And now we're going to have Karen come and talk about some of the other parts of her experience. And to do that, Kathy will just be asking her a follow-up question.
Thanks, Jordan. Karen, it's so good to see you here today.
Thank you, Kathy.
We've known each other for a really long time, and we've had this conversation a lot. But if after hearing everything that Rashida and I talked about, and then watching your video again, really want to give you the floor for what your reaction is to that. And especially, maybe some things that you told NBC Connecticut when they interviewed you, but for whatever reason, that it ended up on the cutting room floor. So elements of your story didn't get told. This just gives you time to share with the audience anything you want to say.
Okay, thank you everybody for taking time to show up today and listen to my story. Hold on, woman, I'm trying to get it loaded up. Give me 1 second, sorry, Kathy. What I wrote is what I think is very important to be said is people who have been through a lot of abuse, who have severe PTSD issues, being in the state system, inpatient, like where I was, a Connecticut Valley Hospital, makes me everything worse. With my history of physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, emotional abuse or other mental health issues, is the worst thing to do is to put someone inpatient facilities, especially as a woman who had been put on one-to-one status. It should not be a male staff person sitting with females. In my own opinion, it made me get more self-abusive when a male mental health worker watched me in the dorm. The big reason why is because I had a situation of a male staff member sexually touching me while I was on a watching me on a sit in the dorm. And this is my other thing. I saw when I was at CVH, I had my rights taken away from me.
when I was discharged out to society, all my rights came back. So having my own place, living in my very own palace, like a queen, I would never want to give it up for the world. I truly worked my butt off for my life out in the community, out in the real world. That's where I am now. And as of today, December 4th of this year, it'll be 8 years I've been successfully. I had a couple of missions at Diawell, but everybody, when I left CVH, they thought I'd be back. That was a Thursday, December 4th of 2014. And as I was walking out, they said, I'll be back in the weekend in the ER and back at CVH. From Director Demas to the CEO of corporate CVH, they told me I would be back. And now I'm almost seeing 8 years, and I've never been back at CVH ever. And never been told I would ever get back there from anybody, no matter what I went through.
Can you talk, and I'm putting you a little bit on the spot here, but can you talk just a little bit more about what it means for you to be in the community and a member of your community, and how engaged you are as a citizen?
Being in the community, while I was at CVH, I watched how people got treated, and I'm like, oh damn, maybe if I can get out and what I do now. I don't have a degree, I don't have anything. I got a high school IEP, but for the last couple of years since I've been on the community, I do a lot of live testimonies. This year and last year was in Zoom for the legislative building, for the budget hearings and stuff. And when I do my testimonies, I'm not just doing for me, I'm doing for those who cannot speak up for themselves. And it means the world to me, because I wish I had someone do that for me. So I know for someone inside who doesn't know how to speak up, how much it means for someone to do that. To the point where now I actually going to be speaking to someone from Senator Richard Bloomfield's office tomorrow from Washington, D.C. about my story. Because I think being in the community is the world to me. For the worst person, for someone to put someone in the hospital, it's like you say, especially a state facility, someone who has a history of hurting themselves, is the worst thing in the world. Because all I did is I got worse. I see it now being out. One person would do this, another person did this. It's like beating each other higher and higher. And it's dangerous. It's not a good place for anybody, but someone who has my issues that I do. I have my downfalls. Yes, I have my scars, but you know what? I'm better now. I have almost 7 months with nothing under my belt with anything. I lost my mom in 2018, and this is the most consistency. I've kept myself in the community and safe with no ER visits for anything for psych or medical except my surgery that I had on June 6th. And if I didn't have if I didn't have my friends from Weight Watchers and Kathy Flaherty and Jordan and Holly and other people, I don't know where I would be. If I didn't have my mom help me get out of CVH almost 8 years ago, like I said, I could still be sitting there. And if anything ever happens to Demas budget, I can wind up back, not because of what I did, because of the system. That's all.
Thank you so much, Karen. You really put the truth of your story out there, and I know that all of us here are grateful to have heard from you. Jordan, I guess at this point I turn it back over to you.
Absolutely. And let me just put myself back on Spotlight. I see Diane in the chat asks if she could ask Karen a question. Diane, would you want to ask?
Hello, Karen. My name is Diane.
Hi, Diane.
I'm a person with lived experience, not inside a hospital for that stretch of time. I'm very proud to be able to speak with you. I want to know if there was anyone who could advocate for you during your hospitalization. Did they, and are you satisfied with what you had?
What I have now or what I had, I am so grateful that my mother, when she was alive, and my sister, who's a big person in Connecticut in the system, if it wasn't for them, my mom hiring an outside lawyer to fight for what I have, I don't think I'd be out here. But when Goodwill, the agency, came in a year before I got out, if it wasn't because of them, I don't know where I would be. I'm grateful for the CLRP. I'm grateful for my family in Capital Region. That's what got me out, and I'm still very grateful for them. So if I didn't have them, even though I had my safeness for over a year, that doesn't always mean everything.
you know, having a good support system, who believes in me, having all the stuff they can go on is what got me out too for the lawyer that my mom and my sister hired.
Thank you. You are so beautiful.
Thank you so much for asking that, Diane. And thank you, Karen, so much for sharing. Are there any other questions? We do have a few minutes left, so. Okay, seeing none. I just want to thank everyone so much.
Denise has a question, Jordan.
Oh,
Denise has a question. Yes.
Good morning, Karen. God bless you, hon, for all that you've been through. What makes you happiest now? Now that you have your own space, what makes you happy now?
Me having my own self-esteem and being a good person, helping others and believing in myself. And having my sister lives by me with my 2 nieces and my nephew. It's just having sobriety and having a life that I never thought I was going to have. That everybody for 24 and a half years of my life was institutionalized. From the age of 16 till I was like 30, almost 40 years old, being in hospitals and I never went to a prom. I never went to a school dance. And now I'm working on trying to get back to a job, and I was able to have my surgery left hip replacement because I'm stable enough. My doctors and my team agreed that I would be able to do it. And you know what? I couldn't have all that done at CVH. I was on a walker and a wheelchair for 8 years before I got out, and it was taking care of it. And I'm doing better. And if I didn't have my life and my place that I have, I don't know. It's just having a good place and knowing that I worked hard to get this. That's what I'm trying to say.
God bless you, Karen. Best of luck, whatever you decide to do.
Thank you so much. And let's see, I see Doris asks a question in the chat. What does your best life look like, and what would help us join you along that path?
Can you say that again, Jordan? Because I didn't get the whole thing, sorry.
Sure. What does your best life look like, and what would help you and help us join you along that path?
What helps my best in my life is me waking up every morning and realizing that I'm still here and I'm not in a hospital and I can do it. If I can go 7 months and I can get that far, I can keep on going, and doesn't mean I have to go backwards with a negative behavior. And having like Kathy, who's not my lawyer, having her, and you and Holly, you know, even though you guys don't probably do as much as you do for me, for other members, it makes me feel so good inside that I have all my support. More than just a lawyer and a head of KTP, you know, friends, you know, and that's what really means a lot to me, having Kathy as a friend, you know, and you as a friend and Holly as a friend, you know.
I think we're all really glad to have you as a friend, Karen. And thank you so much for joining us today. Does anyone have any other questions for Karen or Kathy?
I just want to co-sign what Doris said in the chat, because she's absolutely right. You should not need lawyers to do some of the stuff that we're talking about. You know, I am a lawyer, but I would give anything in the world to have CLRP or legal aid agencies not need to exist, and that I could find something else to do. But I think as long as people's rights are being violated, as long as tenants are being evicted, which is part of what we'll be talking about next time, you know, I'm glad that we exist. And it's truly an honor and a privilege to do the work. And as someone who has myself spent time on the inside of a locked ward as a patient, I think the part of Karen's video that hit home for me was when she was carrying her own keys, because there are always people who can go in and out of those locked doors because either they have a badge that electronically opens it, or in the old days, they really did have rings of keys. And that's a lot of power. And I think part of what we try to do at Keep the Promise Coalition is build the power, the inherent power that's in all of us as people. And when you have that taken away, and you have somebody else who's making decisions about where you're living, what medication you're taking, and how they're going to tell you to recover versus you making your own choices about what works best for you, makes a huge difference. And I see a lot of heads nodding. So I think that's my time the cue to wrap up, but it's why we're here. So I'm so glad that so many people have joined us today. And it's just been a privilege to share space with Rashida and with Karen. So I appreciate the invite to be part of this.
Thank you so much, Kathy. And Rashida, Kathy, Karen, thank you so much for taking part in this today. And thank you everyone who attended. And thank you to the Connecticut Council on Developmental Disabilities and Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, their Catalyst Endowment Fund, for making this possible. As I mentioned at the beginning, and as Kathy just mentioned, we're going to be having 2 more of these later in the summer, one in July on the 28th and one in August on the 25th. The next one will be talking about how to identify housing discrimination and knowing your rights and what to do about it when your rights are being violated. And the third one will be about advocacy and policy that has helped people like Karen and all of the folks with mental health conditions, with developmental disabilities, people of color who want to live in their community and not be segregated. So thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you to our interpreters as well. And with that, I think if you have any questions, please reach out to us. You could reach out to ktpadmin@cahs.org for any questions, and we'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. This presentation is also going to be available online, and we will make the slides available upon request. So please reach out if you have any more questions. And with that, I think we can let you go a little bit early. Thank you so much, everyone.